number of occasions that sort of fine line between coaching and therapy, and you could make the case that there is a bit of a fine line between the two in terms of what's coach, what's therapy. I think erring on the side of caution is important. I've mentioned before, in my own experience, if someone comes to see me for anxiety, even if it's performance related, I always suggest perhaps it might be a good idea to see a GP or mental health professional who can obviously look into potential conditions that might be, because anxiety might not just be performance related. It could be obviously an organic condition, a medical condition, a thyroid. It could be something that needs treatment by someone appropriate in that area, a medical person. Depression also, it runs on the spectrum. Depression is, from sub-threshold to getting up in the morning and not feeling so great, to treatment resistant, and obviously somewhere in between. So we've talked, I've mentioned on a number of occasions, not necessarily on this course, but what I'd like to see in mental health is from a diagnostic point of view, is biomarkers, because at the moment the diagnosis is based on criteria, the DCM, which is, I'm not suggesting professionals, they obviously professionals do a good job with that, but it's sort of based on, criteria, inadvertent to say in the medical field. People go in to get a diagnosis for a condition like, say for example, they measure cholesterol as a biomarker. They're going for diabetes as a biomarker. Mental health, at least in my journey, in all my studies, there's no real concrete biomarkers to help in diagnostic. But for me, then I suppose then you're relying on professional judgment in one respect, irrespective of what the condition is. So what I find quite fascinating is, I mentioned yesterday, some people, let's have something to sort of focus on here. We like to use film as a focal point. So I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't watched it before, but the actual Joker itself, the film, is quite fascinating. And without doing any spoiler alerts and so on and so forth, I think the fascinating thing is, for me, the film, there's a story of nihilism. And we talk about nihilism on the course, where the fine line between nihilism and existentialism, where, the sense of no purpose. There's a story of codependence, of trauma. And we know, based on the research now, that shaming, humiliation is traumatic in many ways. And if you ever get a chance to read The Word, and I'm really hoping to interview him too, by the way, who talks a lot about shame and trauma, Dr. Peter Levine. I've sent an email out to his secretary to do an interview. I'd love to interview him. I like his work very much. He talks about shame and trauma. And you think that the Joker in this film, he's shamed throughout the experience, throughout the film itself, throughout, the Joker played by Joaquin Phoenix, who is Arthur Fleck in the film. He gets humiliated so often, which a lot of us do, to a point, don't we? We all get humiliated. But the point being is that you look at from the outside in, there's obviously PTSD there, post-traumatic stress. Now, post-traumatic stress, by the way, at least in my opinion, in my infinite wisdom, in my learnings, is quite controversial. Not that I'm a clinical expert in the area, but I have covered it in modules on courses. There's a bit of a controversy around that, because is it the event? Is it one event that you have that produces the trauma, or is it this collection of events? Is it through one's upbringing and, beatings and humiliations, or maybe domestic violence, or do you see what I'm saying there? Or is it that one event where, the car crash, or one of both, and the constitution? But one thing's for sure, it does affect the brain's functionality. And you see in the film, the Arthur Fleck, who eventually is in a state and out of movement, where he sort of dances in the bathroom eventually. It's almost like an expression of what's going on inside. Now he goes into freeze mode when he's humiliated, and he's got a condition, a mental health condition, where he laughs uncontrollably. And there's a really poignant scene in the film, by the way, and I've mentioned this really, really poignant scene where it's one of the most poignant scenes you could watch in any film, because he's on a train and he's set upon by 3 thugs, and they, set upon him, and he's petrified. He's not laughing. He's laughing because he's got this condition that when he's worried or stressed, he's petrified he's going to get beaten up, and he's laughing uncontrollably. And he's trying desperately to get the card out to tell him that obviously he's got the condition. But you get the sense that the people beating on him, it probably wouldn't matter anyway. They've decided they're going to beat him. And it's quite poignant because you see this guy who, he's humiliated throughout the film. He's beaten and he's done things, and he's sort of in the beginning, the scene when he gets beaten up, there's still his sign, when he's sort of the clown and trying to promote business, and then he's running after them to get the sign back, and they sort of beat the sign over his head and then beat him to a pulp, and then here he goes again, he's in for another beating. But the point of when he's beating up in the beginning of the film, you see him lying on the floor, and you sort of look closely, you see him sort of reach for the sign, but he doesn't grab it. He's got this sort of like flower, and he kind of sprays water. He goes back into clown mode, but you kind of get the sense when he's beaten upon again, he kind of flips. The sort of that switch, that trigger, is gone at that point. And for me, it's quite poignant because you kind of think he's in so much fear at that point that he just cannot get the words out, and they're beating on him, and you think, wow, you sort of a poignant part of the film, and I think it's an instrumental part of the film because not long after that, without sort of putting a spoiler out, you kind of see him make the transition, this identity Arthur Fleck becomes, and I think that's highlighted, at least in my opinion, this sort of inner state expressed through an outward movement in one respect. But the point being, if you sort of think attachments. Now, if you haven't read the work of John Bowlby, have you come across the work of John Bowlby? So John Bowlby is the psychiatrist during the Second World War. And I find his work really fascinating because John Bowlby talks about attachments, secure attachments, anxious resistance. He talks about anxious avoidant and disorganized and disorientated. Without sort of going into much detail, I'm sure there's better people than me to explain that. But he, through his research and at that time, would see that children who were separated from their parents during the war would suffer a sense of trauma. It would affect their attachment. Now, in the first few years of one's life, it's really important. Now, what does the baby do in the first few years, in the first year a lot of? What does the baby do?
Cry.
Precisely. Well, now, why does the baby cry?
Because it needs something.
Precisely. So, one could hypothesize that attachment creates a basis for relationships in early childhood. Okay? So, in middle childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood, the foundation of our attachment has an emphasis on that sort of first year or so. Because thankfully, for most people, the majority of children grow up with the healthy expectation. When the baby is distressed, what do people generally do? The carers of the parents, what do they generally do? They downregulate the emotion. And the baby can explore the world around them healthily. The baby is hungry, the baby is fed. The baby needs changing, it's changed, and it can sort of carry on about its business. There's comforting, it's secure. Okay? So, in one sense, the child who's securely attached, you could make a point, it sort of grows up with a reciprocal idea of friendship. It's like the child, as the child grows up, begins to realize it's reciprocation. There are times that you might need comforting, there are times I might need comforting, and I'm comfortable with you giving me comforting and vice versa. Does that make sense? But obviously, you look at not every child is grown up in that sort of environment. We'd be naive to think so. And if you look at the Joker, what's sort of quite fascinating in one respect, you sort of look at his sort of early upbringing. Now, it's not very clear what is and what isn't, because it's apparent he's got psychosis to a point. Now, I'm not a clinical expert in psychosis, but I have covered it in a module on a course that I did at level 7. Now, the point being is that you think psychosis, it's debatable, is it not continuum? At what point do we sort of define delusion and not delusion? But you can see evidently that he does have these delusions. So, his early upbringing, it's not really clear. Was he adopted? Who's his real parent? But one thing is for sure that does come out, he suffers immensely. His mum, whether she's adopted him or whether he's the child of whoever he's a child of, because there's, without being a spoiler, he may be the child of the politician running for candidacy. They're not sure, but whatever the situation is, that the realization that as a 2-year-old, he was like chained to a radiator and beat upon by his mother's lovers, so to speak. So she obviously neglected him. And that's sort of in this report he reads. And the irony of that is that when you look at it, you think, well, why, irrespective of whether he's adopted or he's the child, does the mother have the child? Is she, or does she have the child because she, who has borderline and psychosis, to fulfill her need, to gain gratification? Does she get excitement from seeing the child in a morbid way suffer? We know that genes environment correlate to behaviour. The nature-nurture debate is long gone. So at that point you start to realise that, we mentioned earlier about from a Bowlby perspective, that in my infinite wisdom, he's got a disorganised, disorientated attachment. And that's sort of common with children who've experienced maltreatment. Okay? A history of severe neglect. And then what happens to children in that situation? How do you think they face adversity into the future? Are they well equipped with adversity? Not as well as they would be if they were secure. Okay? So their future chances in life and adversity, because you might ask, well, does the reaction in proportion to what's happened, is it in certain situations? Well, probably not for the most part. But equally in saying that, when he's shamed throughout the film, what does he do? He struggles to emotionally regulate. He goes into freeze. And you see that when he sort of idolizes the comedian who's played by De Niro, and it's a sort of dream to be on the show. And when he sort of shames him, he goes into like a crisis, and he sort of freezes. PTSD. He's so severely traumatized, you can see at that point, he just cannot regulate his emotion. And that almost uncovers the schema of when he was tied to the radiator as a child and beaten upon by his mother's lover in that respect, and had no support, no one to look after him. And you think that, from the point of view, if the child expresses a need for comfort and is left feeling worse after they express the need, what do you think is going to happen to that child? What do you think will happen to the child if they're left feeling worse than what they were? If the child cries, and after crying, it's beaten up, or what will the child do eventually? Do you think? Becomes avoidant, doesn't it? The child, certainly does. So, you see that, and certainly in my experience, I used to work in care homes, doing education in care homes. Something that was quite evident, obviously, children, not all children in that environment, but obviously there are a proportion of children in that environment who do have, from the point of view, a history of neglect and maltreatment. You could argue to a point, and they do obviously struggle with adversity because obviously they've not had the chance to develop. But also we know now that trauma has an impact on the brain. So you wonder, in the case of the joke, I reflect what part of the brain is knocked out through these experiences, as well as, on a positive note, some of the research suggests that in a good environment, the person can do well. People do well. Obviously people do go into care and do come out of care and do have relationships, do have lives and do have jobs and do that. But equally saying that the statistics are, and I don't have them with me, that some have a higher chance of incarceration and so on and so forth. So, there is the case that the child then looks for, in one respect, in adversity, salvation as an adult. Now, is there such thing as someone and salvation? When I talk about salvation, I talk about looking for someone to fulfill that parental protection role as a child. Now, a parent should protect the child because the child is very vulnerable, isn't it? The child's very, very vulnerable in the sense that as a species, human beings, unlike our sort of animal cousins, we're quite dependent, aren't we? We really rely on dependent. We can't survive on our own. And if we're left on our own, we're going to struggle to a point. So we rely on adults in that respect. But by looking, the analogy I use, by looking for someone to fulfill that parental role as an adult, it's a bit like, say, if you didn't eat food as a child, if you didn't eat very well as a child, or food wasn't given, can you then eat as an adult to render that? What's going to happen if you eat considerably as an adult to make up for what you didn't eat as a child? Sorry? Precisely. You can't go back, can you? It's not possible. And it's quite distressing. And you see in the film The Joker where there's two adults where one, the comedian, he sort of builds this sort of fatherly figure, potential fatherly figure, but there's also the that Wayne, whatever his name, I can't remember his first name, Wayne. Yeah, he's a Bruce Wayne. Yeah, and he sees him potentially because his mother idolizes him, and his mother alleges, whether it's true or not, has the affair or the child. No one really knows because at that point it's clear that he's got psychosis, so to see. But the point being, when he's rejected by him and says that, no, your mum's delusional, it has a massive impact on him. Because the point being, he's sort of still holding on to the possibility that, but from a psychosis point of view, the damning thing is that he's seeing a therapist and he's under medication and things are under control to a point, but then the cuts come in and he doesn't get that treatment anymore. And there's an interesting thing there. I don't know if you've heard the story before. I did it on a module on the course I was doing one time, and the stories come to mind now. It's at the Maudsley Museum, Mental Health Museum in London. But there's a story of the name will come to me anyway. It's that guy who had, I think he had schizophrenia, and basically what he did is he decided not to take the medication anymore.
Is that Beautiful Mind?
Oh, that's the film with Nash. He was a Nobel Peace Prize. This is a separate one where the guy decides he's not going to take the medication anymore. It's in the museum, and I'll sort of look it up. Someone can probably email me and tell me. It's just come to mind now. But what he does, I think he teams up with a journalist, and he sort of draws pictures on his journey of how he feels. He decides he's going to take the medication eventually, but him and the journalist, I think, plot their course to see what the experience is. Now, of course, as he goes on the journey, the pictures become more and more disturbing. And I recall that the final picture, it's like a picture of an egg that's cracked. And that obviously would be really alarming, you'd think, because obviously at that point you think, wow. So what probably would have happened, would have been that he would have lost touch of reality. He wouldn't have known himself what's real and not real. And it's almost like throughout the film, in The Joker, you kind of could argue what's real and not real. Because obviously if you're not taking the medication that distinguish between, reality and non-reality, and you kind of think, well, eventually the guy sort of committed suicide in that sort of the museum. I don't recall the name. I'll find the name. I didn't actually cover it on the module I did in a course, and it's really fascinating. You go to the museum and you'll see it. It's fascinating in the sense. Obviously, it's, very sad. But I believe it was his brother who decided to make the paintings available for people to see, to sort of distill any myths around psychosis, so to speak. But in the case of the film, it's quite damning in the sense where you sort of wonder what's real and not real. And one thing I observed from a passive observation, I could be completely wrong by the way, and I was sort of observing, because he laughs uncontrollably whenever he's under stress, isn't he? And basically the only time I think he actually laughs genuinely, there's only one time he laughs, and I'm going to spoil it for you, and you put that out for you if you decide to watch the film, you go and watch it. Yeah, there's only one time I actually see him laugh properly, and I'll throw it out there and see if you agree with me. And it's quite fascinating in that sense that you think there's only one time this is it. So in a way it's an indictment in terms of from a mental health point of view, how complicated things are, in the sense that it's not really a straight line, is it? And yesterday was World Mental Health Day too, by the way. I think, was it yesterday? Okay. And for me, every day should be Mental Health Day, because we do need a lot more funding in mental health. There does need to be developments and advancement. There's a lot of comorbidity as well. I think what people forget, depression, anxiety, all the mental health conditions, they have a high degree of comorbidity. And what I mean by that, the effects of it aren't just the effects that we hear. It has a massive knock-on effect in terms of people's quality of life, longevity of life. There's so many things, and I think for me, at least in my opinion, we're so far behind in mental health. And it's good in one point because people are starting to sort of do things about it, but we are still a long, long way behind. And I think that is quite interesting. And by the way, on another note, sort of to break any stigma, I have a speaker, you're probably aware I'm on the committee of the North BPS, and I organise speakers, and there is a speaker actually, it's an open event on the 18th, and she's going to talk about her lived experience with psychosis, I believe, and she's a researcher. So, it sort of does break stigmas, and I think the point being we have this sort of stigma around people, and I suppose in one sense the film, in one sense in one sense it could potentially stigmatise mental health, because obviously most people who've got mental health are probably more of a danger to themselves than they are to anybody else in one respect, and not everyone who sort of has those experiences is going to go off and become the joker, so to speak. But the point being is that I think for me education is certainly key in that aspect, but I still think there are a lot of advancements that need to be made, and certainly I think biomarkers would help, diagnostic criteria would help. If the funding could go towards understanding and mapping the brain better, that would be useful too. But also, it's useful to get people to speak about lived experiences, because it's great getting celebrities to speak about it. They talk about it, and people obviously, look at that. But celebrity position is different to the general person. The celebrity, in one sense, not making light of it, because irrespective of how much money you've got and who you are and status, there's no discrimination. There's many pathways to many of these conditions. But the point being is that the person who's sort of the celebrity, generally speaking, would probably be more affluent than the person who can get better treatment, get better medication, get better care than the person who's got to get up in the morning and look after a couple of kids and on their own, and they're afraid that if it gets out they've got a mental health problem, where there's, it's all good and well saying it's okay not to be okay, but there's still a big stigma around it. If someone else has got a mental health problem, how's that perceived in work? You know, if someone needs to take a day off or two, if someone needs to, so it's still a long way in that respect. And I think that for me, you know, in one respect, there is that sort of fine line between, at least from a coaching point of view, to a therapeutic point of view. And I always say to people, you know, you work on your remit. In one respect, that's always a good place to start, and hopefully the person can get the help that they need from the appropriate person in the appropriate situation. But what I'd like to do now is an exercise, if you may. So what I'd like to do is we're going to pair up in groups and have promote some discussion. And discussion is going to be focus around some of the issues that we've covered throughout the morning and throughout the course thus far, and sort of get you guys to sort of engage. And what I want to start with is sort of what you guys perceive as being coaching, counselling, and therapy, and perhaps we can sort of open things up to your own experiences, because this is quite a variable group. It's a really, really variable group in terms of your own experiences. We've got therapists, we've got coaches, we've got some of you have got past experience of being therapists, some of you go into coaching. So we've got a variable group here, but let's sort of promote some discussion and work and see what sort of your perceptions are on that sort of fine line. It's sort of, what's performance, where one does set a goal, where one does elicit values and one does a protocol, and where do you think you sort of draw the line and say, well, actually, perhaps you might want to get the appropriate treatment off the appropriate person and go from there. So we kind of sort of pair up just a small discussion before we sort of break for lunch.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.